SmackDown beat Raw in terms of ratings, in terms of viewership. SmackDown's live events drew more than the Raw live events of that era. And there were a lot of people here that didn't like that.
Believe it or not, in late 2002, the Blue brand actually managed to top Raw, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of ratings. This is actually somewhat of a controversial topic, and there's actually a lot of conflicting data, but in order for anything here to even make sense, we have to go back a little bit and talk about how a ratings war between SmackDown and Raw ever even started.
Vince wanted competition, and I wanted to compete with Raw. I wanted to whip Raw's ass.
Now, before the Blue brand became its own separate show, it's important to note that it was originally, more or less, just a continuation of Raw. SmackDown first launched back in 1999, but as the years went on, especially heading into 2002, it didn't feel like a must-watch on its own anymore. And looking back, that's wild, considering what SmackDown would eventually become just a few months later. After WrestleMania 18, though, this was becoming a problem, especially with UPN, the network that aired SmackDown. Behind the scenes, UPN was already unsure about having wrestling as a long-term investment. And Paul Heyman would later say that there were real discussions about SmackDown potentially being canceled in 2002.
SmackDown was facing cancellation. SmackDown was really on the fence.
Things needed to change for SmackDown, and with the brand split on the way, it was the perfect timing. SmackDown was handed over to Paul Heyman, alongside Stephanie McMahon, while Raw's creative was led by Brian Gewritz. And from that point forward, Raw and SmackDown weren't just two shows anymore. They were in competition. This was supposed to be huge for SmackDown, but unfortunately the brand was still treated as an afterthought at first. Even after the split, Raw was still considered to be the A show internally. It was live, it was on Monday nights, and it was still where Vince McMahon's attention naturally leaned. So SmackDown didn't just feel like the B show on television. For a while, it genuinely was the B show behind the curtain too. And for somebody like Paul Heyman, that shit was not going to fly.
SmackDown was Raw's bitch. My goal was to make Raw SmackDown's bitch. Make Raw the B show. Make SmackDown the show to watch.
This eventually turned into a bit of a ratings war between the writing teams and roster, with both brands wanting to top the other. And it got pretty serious at times. For example, in Brian Gewirz's memoir, he recalled a story in which the rivalry escalated into a physical altercation between him and Paul, resulting in both men being suspended by Stephanie McMahon.
The first writer I ever had to suspend without pay.
Things got so competitive during this era that reportedly, Paul Heyman would sneak into Raw conference calls to eavesdrop on Brian and the Raw creative team, just to gain an advantage, something that eventually led to his firing in 2004. But we'll talk about that more later, so stay tuned. For now, the point is that WWE had accomplished what it set out to do. And what's interesting here is that this also spilled over into the rosters themselves, with the talent taking pride in their assigned brand.
We're the show that can go, and we'll show every week why we're the show that can go. And it really did take it as a gang mentality to try and beat Raw.
Big Show has also talked about this rivalry in recent years, highlighting how Raw stars would brag to SmackDown stars about being the bigger show.
The Raw group used to laugh at us. Oh, the SmackDown's the B show, SmackDown's the B show. We were the ones that were kicking the crap out of Raw in ratings.
It also carried over into the commentary teams. And under Paul Heyman, SmackDown's announce team wasn't just there to call matches. As Paul explained in an interview, Taz and Cole were also there to fire back at Raw.
I would have Michael Cole and Taz take as many jabs at Raw as I could possibly get away with before there would be backlash against me.
Yeah, dude, Paul Heyman was committed. And here's a fun fact about the commentary teams. Originally, Lawler and JR were planned to be the commentators for every pay-per-view, but Paul Heyman fought against this, insisting that SmackDown matches should be called by the SmackDown commentary team.
We're whipping Raw's ass in terms of viewership. We're drawing more on the split house shows, and unless you want a B team calling your title match, Michael Cole and Taz should close the show.
Paul Heyman and Brian Gewirtz were two very different people with two very different styles and backgrounds. And because of this, SmackDown and Raw would go on to become two different kinds of wrestling shows. This was a major factor as to why SmackDown was able to get an edge over Raw during this era. Once Paul Heyman was leading the ship and the roster was solidified, SmackDown developed its own identity. And honestly, from like 2002 to 2004, it was simply a much better product. But how exactly did this happen? Well, before we get into the ratings, let's talk about what made SmackDown the better product. To do that though, we have to take a little bit of a poop on Raw, as when it came to the Red brand, sure, the show was positioned as the flagship in 2002, but it often didn't act like one.
I don't know whether or not it's the talent that's involved or the writing teams. Sometimes Raw is off the chart good.
Right.
Sometimes it is off the chart bad.
It was a post-Attitude Era show, trying to keep a piece of that old energy alive, except now it felt like the edginess was being chased instead of happening naturally. Shock segments, dirty jokes, and ridiculous sketches that were designed to spike attention right now, even if they undercut the integrity of Raw. For example, segments like Chris Norwensky trying to find out if Molly Holly is a virgin or not. To be fair, it was a different era in 2002, but even by that era's standard, those types of segments aren't necessarily entertaining. They might be if you're like 13 years old, but they're really just the creative team screaming, "Please don't change the channel." And you can see it in how regularly Eric Bischoff would open the show, talk directly to the audience as if they were channel surfing, and try to hook them with spectacle. It felt a little desperate at times. Of course, there were a ton of other issues as well, bad storylines like the Katie Vick angle, Triple H's reign of terror, and more importantly, the lack of new main eventers. I actually have a big video coming on how Triple H really held back a lot of the potential big stars on Raw during this time, for example, RVD, Kane, or Booker T, so stay tuned for that. And don't worry, it isn't just another reign of terror video, it's gonna be a different thing, so just, yeah, anyways. The main point here is that while Raw was the A show on paper, it wasn't necessarily the better show. And this inconsistency didn't just create frustration with fans, it also created an opening. And that opening is where Paul Heyman's SmackDown comes in, because his greatest trick wasn't just some magical secret formula, it was much simpler than that. SmackDown committed to being the thing Raw wasn't. SmackDown was treated like the wrestling show, athletic, competitive, and work rate driven, while Raw leaned into being, I guess, like the entertainment show that was built around bigger characters in promos or talking segments. Paul's described his mindset as looking at what's going to matter a year from now, and once SmackDown locked into this identity, it started to feel consistent in a way that Raw often wasn't. Now, once SmackDown decided it was going to be wrestling first, the next question became obvious. Who's going to benefit from this? And the answer in that era was pretty much anybody who could actually go in the ring, as SmackDown was what I'd call the land of opportunity. In Heyman's eyes, anybody could be a star, and this philosophy is exactly how SmackDown could turn guys who weren't the classic WWE prototype into people who still felt like main eventers. The best example is what fans would eventually call the SmackDown Six, consisting of Kurt Angle, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Edge, Chris Benoit, and Chavo Guerrero. The SmackDown Six were the spine of the Blue brand, and a massive reason that SmackDown had such a consistent reputation. Now, sometimes this concept gets talked about as if it was like a group or a stable, but it was really more of like a writing strategy. Put 6 elite performers in one ecosystem and then rotate between different matchups until all 6 stars are over. A couple of years back, while on Chris Jericho's podcast, Heyman really broke down the concept, and I think he explains it better than anyone else, so let's take a listen.
I got Edge and Ray, I got the Guerreros, I got Benoit and Angle. But what this also buys me is a chance for all 6 of these guys to main event against each other. So you can have Edge versus Angle, or Edge versus Eddie, or Ray versus Angle, or Ray versus Benoit, and you can put them in your main event because you have these 3 teams intertwined with each other, and our ratings are just going through the roof.
By the end of 2002, this strategy had become a massive success, with all 6 stars becoming the face of the SmackDown brand. Eddie Guerrero would go on to become a world champion, and the same goes for Kurt Angle, Edge, and I mean, if we compare this over to Raw, what was the Raw 6? It would just be like 6 Triple H's. Moving on though, another element of Paul Heyman's SmackDown was how it was also the breeding ground for a lot of younger stars. To be fair, Raw was also doing the same with Randy and Batista, but on SmackDown, we had the likes of OG John Cena. He'd make his debut in 2002, and according to Paul Heyman, he was one of the people who handpicked John from OVW. Keep in mind, this was like 5 months before Cena started rapping, and the whole Doctor of Thugonomics gimmick was actually more of a Stephanie McMahon creation. competition. But the point here is that SmackDown was the perfect environment for a young John Cena to grow. Then you've also got Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas, a perfect example of SmackDown's ecosystem turning new into ready. They came in as Team Angle, and suddenly SmackDown's tag team division was even better. As most of you know, John would go on to be one of WWE's biggest stars like ever, and Shelton Benjamin also went on to have a great career throughout the Ruthless Aggression era, winning the IC title on multiple occasions. And I mean, who knows if these stars would have ever popped off if not for SmackDown. So yeah, when you zoom out, Paul Heyman's SmackDown wasn't just better wrestling. It was a philosophy: make the ring the main character and let opportunity create new stars. Raw was already weak at this time, as we went over. They were low on HP, alright? They were low on life points. And it was time for SmackDown to have its moment and shine. So let's dive into the numbers and see if SmackDown was ever able to pull ahead. This is actually a very controversial topic, as according to Paul Heyman in this clip I'm about to play, SmackDown began to beat Raw across the board in 2002.
SmackDown beat Raw in terms of ratings, in terms of viewership. SmackDown's live events drew more than the Raw live events of that era. And there are a lot of people here that didn't like that.
If we ask WWE, they claim that this victory was much more brutal than any Nielsen rating would have you believe, with SmackDown supposedly beating Raw from July 2002 to February 2003. This information specifically comes from this chart I'm showing on screen right here, that was featured in a couple of different WWE documentaries. The issue is that when we look at archived ratings from this era, the numbers on WWE's chart do not align with Nielsen or any other company's TV rating archives at all. And it made me ask, was WWE lying to us? But the answer actually comes down to how these shows were measured. Raw was on paid cable, while SmackDown was on free broadcast TV through UPN. Nielsen measured both, but broadcast and cable were never a perfect apple-to-apples comparison, due to broadcast having a wider household availability. Now, that doesn't automatically prove WWE's chart is right, but it does explain why WWE's version of the story and public archives do not line up accurately. And another thing to keep in mind here is that WWE wasn't just looking at one number or metric. The archived ratings are really just one piece of the puzzle, and internally, WWE would have had access to a much wider range of data. But even if you strip all of that away and just stick to the publicly available data, SmackDown still has something real to hang its hat on, as there were multiple weeks during that stretch where even by Nielsen standards, SmackDown beat Raw outright. So don't worry, I didn't clickbait you. SmackDown did beat Raw in the ratings a couple of times, so let's talk about it. For example, on September 12th, 2002, SmackDown pulled ahead of Raw with a 3.7 rating compared to Raw's 3.4. Then again, on November 7th, SmackDown also beat Raw, with them doing a 3.6 while Raw did a 3.5. Just 1 week later, on November 14th, 2002, SmackDown did it again, beating Raw 3.6 to 3.15. And even late into the year, on December 26, 2002, SmackDown was still right there, picking up another win at 3.4 to 3.25. And I mean, it becomes even more impressive when you look at what else SmackDown was going up against. I feel like a dinosaur talking about this part because I know some of you guys watching are young, but back in the day, especially during the early 2000s, a Thursday night on cable was one of like the most competitive nights on television, stacked with massive network shows pulling tens of millions of viewers. But SmackDown was still able to hold its own, and even beat Raw a couple of times. Raw was supposed to be the A show, right? The one with the bigger budget, the live slot, and the full backing of Vince McMahon. So for SmackDown to even touch Raw in the ratings even a couple of times says everything about how strong the blue brand had become. Unfortunately though, all good things have to come to an end, and in late 2003, Paul Heyman got fired from his position as SmackDown head writer by Stephanie McMahon. This happened after Paul was caught listening in on a Raw creative conference call in an attempt to get an edge over Brian Gewritz and the Raw team. The man himself gave us some insight into this during an appearance on the Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast, trying to explain what exactly happened. So here's a clip of it.
But I had a big falling out with WWE because I got busted listening in to the Raw conference call. And the truth of the matter is, I didn't really listen into that call.
As you just heard, Paul notoriously denies that he was listening in on that day, but he does eventually admit to something else.
He goes, so you're going to tell me now that you listened in? And I said, Vince, I didn't listen into that call. But I did listen in to the 6 other calls in the previous weeks before that.
Now that's gonna do it for today's video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please subscribe. And just saying, I'm so thankful for everybody who's been supporting the channel. I've got tons of more videos on the way. I even have another SmackDown video coming. I actually have a couple that are going to cover all of the different years of SmackDown, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'm gonna shut up now, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.